Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Feudernick, and my guest today is Brook Manville. He's the author of a new book that's getting a lot of acclaim and one that I really enjoyed reading myself. It's called The Civic Bargain: How Democracies Survive. Okay, you're probably wondering, what does a book like that have to do with conflict and schools and this podcast? Well, as you will hear in a moment, it has a lot to do with it. Brook says that a democracy like ours depends on 7 essential conditions. The first one is that there is no boss except one another. The last 2 of the 7 have really important connections to education. One of the conditions is what he calls civic friendship. We'll find out what that means in a moment, but the other condition that Brook says is vital to democracy is civic education. As you will hear shortly, civic education is not just what students learn in high school civics class. What's important, though, is that without these 2 things and 5 other conditions, democracies don't survive. And these are the things that schools can and must cultivate. Brook, welcome to Courageous Conversations.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, great. Before we get into these conditions that you say need to exist in order for democracies to survive, civic friendship and civic education, talk about your book in general terms and what prompted you to write it.
So the book came about when my co-author, Josh Ober from Stanford University, and I were serving together on a panel in the National Geographic Society a few years ago. And it was during the election of 2016. There was a lot of concern about the fate of democracy, and many people were wondering, and there were articles being written, and there were a few other books that had been written about, the decline of democracy, democracy dying. And we were on a panel together and asked by the moderator. The subject of the event was essentially the future of democracy. So we talked about some ideas, and it was very interesting. The audience was a jam-packed room, included several U.S. government officials, and in fact one of the members of the Supreme Court at the time. So there's quite a lot of interest. And after we said our things, and we both, Ober and I, are trained as historians, so we talked historically a little bit about it. And then the questions from the audience started coming, and they were fast and furious, and people started talking with one another. It was very clear that there were a lot of different ideas about what democracy is, about how much history can inform us or not inform us, whether this was essentially a partisan war or was it something deeper. And after that, Ober and I stepped back and said, we've had a lot of ideas together. He and I have worked together in different publications in the past. Maybe it's time to write our own version of what do we think is, the future of democracy. So we started the book with just a sort of a vague idea. And after a while, we realized that a central theme that would be useful is, instead of projecting, as many people were doing at the time, about whether democracy was truly dying, and if so, did it have 3 years of life or 5 years of life? We said, supposing we turn the question on its head and say, when democracy has been strong, and even when it was first invented, what allowed it to be strong? What allowed it to get going? And what has kept it going? So if we could bring sort of a wellness perspective as opposed to a disease perspective to the question, that might be something fresh and interesting. So to do that, we looked back, and we both are trained in Western civilization-oriented kind of subjects. We both study Greek history. He still writes about Greek history, and also we said, let's look at the most well-known democracies in Western civilization. Or, you can argue, but 4 are always there. The ancient Athenians from the classical Greek age, 6th and 5th century BC, 4th century. The Roman Republic before it became an empire, that's 1st century BC. And then the rise of the British parliamentary system, because that is one of our still going democracies. And of course, the American constitutional government that we all live under. And if you look at all of those, the two ancient ones did eventually die out or become success, part of another empire. The British democracy and our democracy are still going strong. People may say not so strong, but they're still kicking, if you like. But all of them lasted for some long period of time or had continued to last. Just to cut to sort of a quick summary, what we said, if you look at those four democracies, when they, as long as they lasted and when they were also doing their best, what were the things that, they had to kind of get clear about and come to some kind of understanding? And those are those 7 points that you mentioned. But before I get to the 7 points, I want to say the framework for the whole idea was that, if we want to look at these democracies, which are pretty different in certain ways, the parliamentary system is quite different from our system, and ancient Greece is quite different from colonial America, and so on. We had to try to get to some fundamentals, and we tried to say, what are the things that they have in common, so that at a general level we can start to compare them. And we said, an interesting way to look at this is that they all kind of represent a sort of a bargain, which is when a society of people come together and say, look, we want to govern ourselves, which is essentially sort of Aristotle's very simple definition of democracy, citizens governing themselves. Um, what are we going to, how are we going to do it? And inevitably, it involves coming up with some kind of an understanding amongst ourselves about what we will allow, what we will agree to, things we will not, we don't want to have. And in the end, we make sort of a bargain, we make sort of a deal. We will continue to govern ourselves as citizens as long as we kind of keep to these rules of the game and to keep to these values. So we said that was an interesting way to think about democracy as a sort of a bargain amongst people. And I think the reason it's helpful, a bargain amongst citizens, it's helpful is that when you talk to many people about democracy, they tend to project a very kind of idealistic view. I think democracy is when, all people of different races and backgrounds get along together. Or I think democracy is when, it was like in the Eisenhower years in America. Or I think democracy is when we, have bound together to save the planet. I mean, people are often very idealistic. And we said, look, if you kind of strip out the idealism of it for a moment and say, just kind of methodologically, how does it work? It's when people of often very different perspectives, which, you see every day in our political situation, come together and agree, look, there are going to be certain rules that no matter what, we're going to agree to. And as long as those rules and as long as that agreement holds, our democracy will be strong. And if we start to trespass on those rules or we start to lose trust in the other people, that those basic kind of fundamentals, we call them the essential conditions, are no longer, then the democracy becomes weak and ultimately probably does demise. And this notion of bargain, I think, again, is very important because it comes back to the point that democracy exists only if the citizens are willing to make these kind of trade-offs with one another, to trust one another, to keep to the rules. I was thinking about it the other day. It's almost a little bit like, to use a metaphor, like baseball. If kids come together and want to play baseball on a vacant lot, they have to agree there are going to be certain rules we're going to follow. The rules of baseball. We're not going to hit each over the head with bats. We're not going to take the ball home if we're angry because we were struck out. There's just going to be, and as long as we follow the rules, we can play the game, and the game will be very different. And people have different opinions about, who should bat first, who should bat second. But we got to follow the rules. So it was that kind of idea. So to some degree, it strips it out from it's only a democracy if I see this kind of outcome. It's only a democracy if we're working on global warming. It's only a democracy if people of color, are remedied for injustice those things can be decided, but they're not the underlying rules and they're not part of the bargain.
Two of those conditions that we're going to talk about that you say are really essential for democracies to survive are something you call civic friendship and then civic education, but not necessarily civic education in the narrow sense of what happens, what's taught in a classroom. But before we talk about those two things, I just want to share an observation I've had recently. And in the last couple of election cycles, there's been a lot of talk among some people saying that our democracy is in peril. It's at risk. And others say, no, no, it's really not. We'll survive this. And if we're not really violating, what we might think the basic principles of a democracy are. But then I'm hearing and maybe reading into it, I'm wondering if you think this is true, that there are some people saying, well, so what if it is? So what if it is at risk? Uh, maybe it's time we try something else. And I'm wondering if you think that people are perhaps just curious about a different system or so frustrated with how our system is working that they're willing to entertain the idea that maybe what we need is, say, a more authoritarian government that would no longer be about a civic bargain. It would be about someone else telling us how we ought to act and be in our country.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And in fact, everything you said is underway in some corner of this country already. I mean, I look at a lot of surveys, and one of the Pew Foundation asks all sorts of things about democracy. And one of the questions they have asked is, would America be better with a single strong leader or something like that? And that number used to be almost zero who would answer that, but it's been rising. I mean, there's a non-trivial amount of people who say yes to that. I don't remember the latest one, but sometimes it's as much as 20 or 30%. So it's out there. There's a very popular blogger. In fact, there's a few bloggers out there who have made their niche talking about why monarchy is really what we need. And they have a lot of followers. And then I think the other thing that's going on, which you put your finger on, is our politics is very frustrating, particularly now with such partisan gridlock and whatnot. And I think a lot of people are just very frustrated, and they just say, I'm done. Just tell me what to do. We just need somebody who can kind of get things going. We need a quote benign dictator. People talk about that, et cetera. So that is a concern, to be sure. Uh, because if you go back, I just want to tick off our seven conditions before we get to the last two. The very first one we say is to be a democracy, you have to essentially have no boss. I mean, people say the rule of law, that's a fancy way of saying it. Aristotle's definition, which we often, invoke, citizens governing themselves. But the most essential thing is for a democracy is that we agree that there will not be one single person or one very small elite, oligarchs or whatnot, who essentially tells us what to do. And you can add on lots of other things in order to be a democracy, and we have some other in our, implied in our conditions. But we think that's the very first thing. That as soon as you say, "No, give us a boss," it's no longer a democracy. Now, maybe some people will be happier. Maybe there's a world of nirvana out there waiting for the right leader, but it's not a democracy. So, when you talk about is democracy threatened? The first follow-on question is, right, well, what do you mean by democracy? And we tried to keep it very simple in the book and said it's people governing themselves without a boss, without a single leader. And the fact that many people are now frustrated and wanting to invoke or have a boss, and many of the people cheering our current president, I think in some ways hope that he becomes more of a boss. So, you just have to sort of use that as a definitional starting point that democracy is no boss. Um, so that's our starting point. After that, you can point to other things, which I just want to tick off. One is that you have to have some shared commitment to security for everybody. We have to prioritize. If China invaded us tomorrow, we have to all say that's a bad thing. We have to do what we do to stop them from taking over and making us their subjects. We have to have institutions that are led by citizens. We can't have like professional, administrators. I mean, we can have bureaucracies, but we have to have the accountability of citizens. We have to define who is and who is not a citizen. And that's very important and what citizenship means. I think one of the reasons there's been a lot of stress in recent times about immigration is not so much that we don't need immigrants, everybody acknowledges that. It's just that the laws and the definition of what citizenship has become have become very blurry. So that's another one of our conditions. Uh, the next one is that people must be willing to compromise and negotiate with one another in good faith. And the reason compromise, I think, is an important condition to point to, is if there's no boss, you have to find some way to work it out with people who disagree with you. I mean, that's kind of that's kind of the Bermuda Triangle. You can always have a boss and then not have to think about it. As soon as you say there's no boss, we have the only boss we have is each other. And if you have, if you have each other's boss, then you have to compromise. And I think with that is another point that we like to stress, which is we have to think about democracy as an imperfect thing, it's a human construct. And a lot of the problems we get into is people's, zero sum game of it's my way or the highway. I want this kind of social engineering to be done. I don't want to have any compromises, or I want to have taxes and I don't want any kind of compromises. You can't have a democracy if nobody is willing to compromise. And compromise means you're not going to get everything you want, but if democracy is working, you're better off in the deal as a citizen of America than saying, I'm leaving, I'm going somewhere else. So that's this imperfection, this less than absolute nirvana is an important thing which is often forgotten and end up people arguing about their vision of nirvana is better than somebody else's and they try to, bullet through Congress or whatever.
I would just say, Brooke, right on that point, that the messiness of the compromise process is probably one of the things that causes people to say, we just need someone to tell us what to do.
Right, right. When they say that, and I hope he tells me exactly what I want to hear.
Yeah, yeah, that's
It's
right.
like, oh, I did, I didn't sign up for this, I thought we were gonna, have freedom of religion. Suddenly the boss says, no, everybody's gonna go to a Christian church on Sunday.
Yeah, yeah.
So yes, that is and people who have not lived in a non-democratic state don't know what, a real boss feels like.
And that's where civic education seems to me is so critical because in civic education, teaching of history, that's where people that have never experienced it, alternatives get to find out about it.
I completely agree. I mean, one of our many, learnings as we were writing this book and talking to different people about it is how many people have, particularly younger people, have no experience whatsoever with, a non-democratic nation. They don't really understand, and they take for granted what we have, as imperfect as it is.
Mhm.
And so I think you're absolutely right. That's certainly a big part of the new civic education must be a much greater emphasis, I think, on consider the alternative. What does it really feel like to have to be a subject in a tyrannical regime? I mean, if you lived in Soviet Russia, you would not be worrying about what different people's pronouns are. You'd be worrying about a lot of different things, much more significant in your daily life. So yes, agreed. Before I get to civic education, I know you wanted to touch on civic friendship. That's part of what we have as our list of things that must be agreed to in the bargain. And civic friendship is in many ways part of civic education. It's what civic education must help teach. And let me tell you, start off by what it's not. It does not mean that you agree with everybody. It does not even mean that you necessarily personally like everybody in the sense that you would like to have them to dinner or go to a ball game with them. I mean, you know, it just means that you know how to get along with them and you have enough respect for them and they have enough respect for you that you can continue to kind of, as it were, do business with each other. So if democracy is basically a bargain, you have to preserve the means by which you continue to bargain with one another in good faith about what are we collectively going to do for our greater common good. And so that's why civic friendship, it's often confused. It's thought that you have to, just love everybody. Can't we just export all the people away from this country that voted for the president that I didn't like? No, you have to accept fellow citizens and you have to have enough dignity and respect to continue to work with them and appreciate that, if they have different points of view, at least some of those ideas might be worth pursuing, even if you didn't think about them. And so compromises can come from good ideas from everywhere.
I think what I'm trying to do with this podcast and having conversations about controversial topics about, gender and sexual identity in schools, the books and materials kids have access to, whether teachers are indoctrinating and all these other things that sometimes lead to culture wars in schools, is to get people to come to the table, so to speak, to the recorded call and say, can we be civic friends during this conversation? Which
Right,
means we're going to treat each other with some degree of dignity rather than contempt. It means that we will actually listen and check with the other person. Do I understand you correctly? This is what and I often ask people, say, before you share your opinion on this, can you just repeat back, what Amanda Ripley has this great book, High Conflict, says, can you just summarize what you heard the other person's? And
right,
sometimes people have a hard time doing that because they haven't been listening. They've been just rehearsing their own, what they're going to say. But when people do it, that leads to this sort of civic friendship in the way you're describing it. That yes, and the one thing I say in the school setting that often gets people much more likely to be friendly towards one another when I remind people that, or ask people, what is this all for? It's ultimately for our children and the
right,
students in our schools and the future of our democracy, our country, is if we aren't willing to be civic friends and we don't model civic friendship, that's what our children are going to learn. And that doesn't bode well for our future. And most people say, you're right. That usually is something that brings people back and says, yes, we have to do that.
right. Well, and the 2 points are very closely linked, as you hint, because one of the when we get into civic education, one of the things is obviously about the way in which you listen and learn from one another and speak to one another. That takes place in a well-moderated classroom. And that's something that you want children coming out of, the right kind of school to sort of have in their deep in their souls by the time they graduate. And they're bringing that to the public space. Which is why it's so discouraging when these school board meetings turn into the riot fests because it's it's exactly what shouldn't be happening in a school. Not to say that there aren't emotionally good and valid points that are being exchanged, but yes, we have to. Part of civic education has to be the mindset and the process of working with tomorrow's fellow citizens, which young students will be.
So I want to share with you something that your book prompted me to think about. I had had a conversation on the sister podcast, Teacher Stories, with a guy named Marvin Berkowitz. He heads up the Center for Character Education at the University of Missouri, and he spoke to me about what schools can do to teach students about democracy. And he said we need more and better character education. Here's what Marvin Berkowitz said as part of my conversation with him.
I think that what's happened with our democracy and democracies around the world is we've lost our way in terms of what democracy is. As I said earlier, democracy is supposed to be a collaborative enterprise where we come together in the common sphere, searching for the common good across differences in a way that's effective, that maximizes the greater good for the greatest number of the people. And I think the common good as a concept is an endangered species in democracies. We've lost the sense of what the common good is. And democracies have sort of devolved into a mathematical enterprise where everybody votes for self-interest or votes out of fear or votes out of hatred and bigotry, out of ignorance, but for something that I want, and whoever has the most wins. That never was supposed to be what democracy is. And for democracy to move from this band together against the enemy and see if we can accrue more votes than them, to a collaborative enterprise of searching for the common good, maximizing the good for all, requires the character of the citizens. And if churches and families and others and so on could do that alone, fine. They can't, they don't, they won't, they do some of it, but we all need to be involved in it. I mean, ultimately, our students will be our coworkers and our neighbors and the people who take care of us. You know, as George Benson wrote, I think he wrote it, I believe the children are the future. Not a matter of belief, it's a matter of fact. There is no future without children. There's no moral future without moral children. And there's no democratic future without democratic children. So character education is a critical piece of all that. And I think we have to, accept it and then leverage it for the good.
So before I have you respond to this, Brooke, I just want to say that I hope people will tune in and listen to that episode. We'll be posting it on Courageous Conversations as well. We'll create a link to it. But some of you may be thinking character education. You put something up on the wall each week. It's Honesty Week or Be Kind, and it's much more involved than simply these platitudes. It's really running schools and organizing classrooms in a way that expects good character from students and allows students to learn how to work through messy problems, say when people are not being honest or kind, or when they encounter bullying. It's working through those things. And I really think, and I'm curious to know if you agree, that what he's calling for is the cultivation of civic friendships and, what Tim Shriver talked about is trying to get people, including adults, to treat one another with dignity rather than contempt. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what you heard Berkowitz say there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what he said. I think I had a chance to listen actually to the longer episode, and it was very interesting. I recommend it to anybody who is listening to this conversation. I think the challenge is to some degree about language. I mean, what does character actually mean? For some people, it's the judgment of what's good and what's bad, and the courage to act on those things. And that sort of says, okay, but the problem is what's good and what's bad may differ from people. I think there is a common, he mentions this in the conversation you had with him. There is a sort of a short list of things that most people will tend to agree on about, treating other people with dignity, telling the truth, not using violence to have your way, and things like that. But values and social values, which is often impugned or attached to character, have changed through time. I mean, there were certain values about how women were supposed to behave in the 19th century, which we don't think are right today, or many people don't think are right. We had a period in our history where certain races were looked down upon, or even punished for being of a different color. Obviously we don't believe that anymore. So just getting to what are the values is actually a non-trivial thing, and the world is changing, and some of those values may be different for tomorrow than if we had been parachuted into a school classroom, in the 19th century. So I think we have to be aware of that. But I think his point is absolutely critical, though, which is the heart of democracy is people coming together to agree, again, by my worldview, imperfectly, on the common good. I mean, that's what democracy is. We don't have a boss telling us what the common good is. The common good is what we collectively think is the common good. Now, if you can't, in a humane and dignified way, figure that out together, democracy will die because with no boss, so he's right that that's what the common good is. Where I get a little worried is his view. He says, we have to collaboratively figure it out. I don't disagree with that. But for many people, collaboratively means, oh, we have to all agree the same thing, or we have to all be kind of the same kind of person in order for this to work. But the heart of democracy is, in fact, not just, occasional agreement, but frequent disagreement. And part of, I think, finding the common good is accommodating some very different worldviews and finding some kind of, intermediate, workable solution that most people can live with. And that becomes the common good. But it has to get worked out. And part of working it out is people having the character, to use Mr. Berkowitz's word, the character to figure out how to do that in a way that preserves the democratic ethos of working together as we need to for the greatest good for the most number of people.
I think what Berkowitz would say is, and I think this is consistent with what you said earlier, Brooke, and that is that there are a few non-negotiables. One is that democracy uh, is an important system to try to strive for, and it applies in our classroom, treating each other with dignity rather than contempt, not being violent, telling the truth. There's a few
Right.
things that we have to just all agree to as non-negotiable. Beyond that, though, and how who gets to go uh, gets library privileges or all the things that we might work out that seem maybe mundane from the outside but that matter to kids, and do I get access to my cell phone in class, and those are all issues that are the messiness of democracy that in a micro level can get worked out in school where people are getting practice with it. But I think both things are true. There's stuff to be worked out where reasonable people can disagree and should disagree, and people should be part of those conversations. And then there's a few non-negotiables, which is democracy is good. We should be striving for it, and we have to treat each other respectfully. Tell the
Right.
truth.
Right. I think it's important also to mention, I don't know if you alluded to this, but what makes schools interesting is that they are really, you want them to be breeding grounds for democratic values and democratic behaviors. Um, but it doesn't mean that schools should necessarily be a democracy. Um, I mean, the kids are there and they're young and they're less experienced and less knowledgeable than the teacher in the front of the room. So the teacher sometimes has to say, no, I'm sorry. We're not going to take a vote that everybody can play TikTok for the first hour of class because, there's more of us than there is of the teacher, right? Uh, there's certain things where you just have to assume you're not yet adults, you're not yet full citizens, to use the political science lingo, that you are empowered to democratically decide anything you want in a school. That said, by staging the right kind of conversations in class, by listening to different points of view, by having debates and even selectively taking votes, which speaker do we think made the best points? All that teaches kids about democracy.
There's a distinction that, and I don't remember who it was that I read many years ago when I was learning to become a teacher myself and learning about discipline and management. And there was a distinction someone made between being authoritarian and authoritative. And the authoritarian is essentially a teacher who stands up in front of class and says, these are the rules, you will follow them, and all major decisions are made by me. So let's get going. That's authoritarian. Authoritative is that there are certain rules that exist when you come in the classroom that are non-negotiable, and certain ways that the subjects we're going to study and learn or things that we've decided. And but I'm going to explain the reasons for it, and I want to entertain your questions about it. And you may be curious why do we do it this way, not that? And I want you to understand it. Authoritarian leader wouldn't do that. You just do what I say. And also, we're going to try to find places where we can invite you to participate in a decision about what the class is, how we're going to operate. And there is a room there still for democratic decision making and to give them some experience. Like, okay, we've got a problem. People are concerned about X, and how can we resolve this together? Rather than what the authoritarian would say is the solution is you go over here and you go over here. And if you don't do that, you'll be punished for it.
Well, plus we have to remember that in our democratic society, a lot of the things that are authoritative mandates or laws, if you like, were decided by, by democratic leaders, perhaps in another era. For example, it is required that students go to school, but that was decided by, democratic assemblies that we need to have our kids educated.
Mhm. Right,
So
right.
it doesn't mean that every law, every rule, every decision must be open to a vote, or else it's tyrannical. So you have to kind of do it at different levels, as it
But if
were.
a student said, why do we have to go to school? One answer, because we do, and we've decided now let's get back to talking about history. You could also respond, say, that's a really interesting question. What would our society be like if you said, we don't have to go to school if you don't want to?
Right.
Let them work through that.
Yes.
I mean, you've already the answer is we do, but I want my students, to be thinking about that, and maybe argue a position that it shouldn't be, and then we'll sort of think about what life would be like in a society that didn't require kids to go to school.
Well, I mean, a sort of a real life example of that is there was a lot of pressure in many schools that everybody should strive to go to a liberal arts college. Um, And, we're beginning to see in terms of the economy and changing technology and everything that that's not the right answer for a lot of people. And, questioning that kind of mandate and saying, gee, maybe we need to have other avenues so that those of us who don't want to, be an unemployed, art historian can find ways into careers that are meaningful and needed by our country. So yes, I think it's this balancing act between continuing to challenge, explore, and debate, but also understand there's a place for at some time for certain rules and top-down decision making and leadership also, by teachers, by school principals, et cetera. And finding that balance, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah,
And, both extremes are wrong. Complete, hierarchical, Nazi Germany, this is what everybody will do, or else is bad. But so is everything that anybody wants to do and is open to a vote is fine too. That's not ideal, and we have to find the balance.
yeah. Well, let's move on to civic education. This is the seventh in your list of seven conditions that you argue have to exist in order for democracies to survive. And I alluded at the beginning of our conversation that when you talk about civic education, you don't necessarily mean that it's done exclusively through the civics course that someone might take in high school. It's a bit bigger than that. But talk a little bit about what civic education is and why you say it may be the most important thing that we as a society can do to preserve our democracy.
Well, I think Professor Berkowitz sort of gave the one-line answer, which is without children thinking the right way democratically in the future, there will be no democracy. So it's really important because you are sort of inculcating the future generation to do what's needed to preserve, to use our phrase, the civic bargain, and not just preserve it, but to continue to evolve it and change it as conditions need. It's a very flexible concept. But that comes about by people having the right values, the right temperament, the right understanding of how democracy works. So I think that's the importance of it. The real question before that, however, is what exactly is it? And you hinted at a sort of a more traditional narrow definition. I would say it's even in many ways broader than maybe many people listening to this podcast would think. If you look back at history, at the ancient Athenians and the Romans and and certainly early America and the British parliamentary experience, civic education took place at many levels and in many ways. For example, in ancient Rome, there were schools, but a lot of what people learned, first of all, was in the family, but second of all, through public displays, through holidays, through ceremonies where certain, famous generals were lionized for certain values, the sort of discipline and bravery. These were things in the public sphere that inculcated certain values and certain attitudes about what we Rome believe makes for a great republic. Um, in this country, our Fourth of July parades, Memorial Day, participation in local civic organizations. I mean, de Tocqueville famously said, the strength of American democracy is all the volunteer organizations that people participate in, because in those they may be raising money for orphans or whatnot, but they're engaging in participative and usually some kind of democratic process about how are we going to do this, who's going to take the lead, is that really the right thing we should be doing? So I think it's not just the schools that have responsibility for civic education. Um, the whole question of religion has become, unfortunately, a very politicized one. But, for many years, much of what people learned about values took place in churches and took place in organized religion. As religion becomes less and less, um, popular for many people, that piece of sort of moral learning, if you like, is fallen out of the equation. And as many of our public holidays have also, I think, gotten much more commercialized, I think much of the civic learning. What am I supposed to understand about the 4th of July? So we need to think bigger than just the schools. Now, that said, the schools play a very important role, of course. We've talked a lot about values and I'll call the process of democratic participation and engagement. Some schools include as part of their civic education, volunteer work in the community or participating in organizations. I mean, in earlier times, it was common for many students to go join the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts because those were, again, participative, civic-oriented organizations. Um, But then, even more narrowly within the school, in addition to kind of the process, there is clearly stuff about the history. Where did democracy come from? And I think the point you made earlier is the one that is certainly made in our book, which is to understand democracy, you also understand what non-democracy looks like in other parts of the world. Um, you have to learn, yes, it's good to know about the three branches of government and all that, but it's very important to understand, well, how do other, democracies do it and what's different and why is ours better? So there's the political science piece, there's the kind of the skills piece, there's the values piece, there's the history piece. And then the last thing I want to say, especially since we have lots of educators, I want to make sure that we do not lose one of the most important parts of civic education, which is for American students to get good at their other academic subjects. It's very important for the health of our nation that people know how to do algebra and that people do know how to write and do reading comprehension. And, as you well know, our scores on NAEP and these international, comparison surveys that are done, America's academic skills in the school, continue to struggle and fall below what they once were. So I think, I don't want civic education just to be like this little corner, like, on Friday afternoon, we talk about how a bill becomes a law, but there's a civic duty, if I will, to continue to improve our schools and get good at academic subjects as well.
Some would argue that we've just haven't paid as much attention to basic skills. There are some out there that think that schools just aren't simply paying attention to those skills, and that's why we're behind. because I've done research and work with struggling schools. What I know, in fact, there was an expert witness in a pretty important case in California, the Vergara versus State of California, arguing that schools are letting down low-income kids, and you ought to be able to get rid of bad teachers just like that, no due process. And I tried to bring data into my testimony showing that many of those schools that are struggling with the basic subjects you're talking about, they have high numbers of teachers that are completely unqualified. They're on emergency permits. They have. Do you have a PE teacher teaching at the algebra class that you mentioned with very little deep background in algebra it's because they haven't been able to find a way to attract and keep enough of those teachers, partly because we don't pay teachers enough. So it's a choice that part of our civic bargain in America, I would argue, is that we have decided that, in my view, we don't invest enough in the teachers that we need to have, not just for civic education, but for those other subjects like math and reading and writing that are so critical. I'm wondering what your
Yes.
thoughts are about that.
No, totally agree. Look, if you go back to, the 19th century when the public school movement got started, it was this notion that, the citizens of this country, must, on the public coin, be educated because we need to have people who have, literary and numerical and also character skills. So if you go back to, Horace Mann and all those people, civic education was just like one piece of the palette. It was not the only thing, but it was all part of this coherent view of that we need to have people who are educated to take leadership in the next generation to keep our democracy, meaning not just our government system, but our way of life vital. Now we can say, look, America has changed a lot since then. It's continuing to change. There have been huge amounts of disruptions. Our teachers are not paid the way they once were relative to, or they can't afford to live given the way the economy's changed and so on. So all of the pieces of what was once a coherent system have either, decayed or fallen out of alignment or need to be reinvented because of how demography and economy has changed. So it's just a question of creating, a whole system and for people in schools to think about not just what do I need to do to make better citizens as well as better, educated young people, but how do I somehow help to foster, the rebuilding of the wider system in our society so that we can make the next generations of great American citizens? I think that is the challenge now.
Brooke, I think we'll leave it there. We've had a great conversation, and I'm left thinking about things that you wrote about in your book and things that you said today. And I hope our listeners are doing the same. But I think with that, I want to thank you for being part of this podcast.
Thank you very much, Kathy. There's rich questions and so much more to think about. But thank you for the opportunity, and I hope it stimulates some further thinking amongst your audience.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Well, for those listening, you can find this episode and some episode notes, including some information about Brook's book, The Civic Bargain, and a link to the conversation I had with Marvin Berkowitz at schoolconversations.org. You can also find this and all of our episodes wherever you listen to your podcast. So long, everybody.